Navigating a disagreement. I'm Erin Whaley. I'm a partner at Troutman Pepper, and I am pleased to be able to start the day with you again today. So in this panel, we are talking about navigating disagreements. Those of you in the room may know that Carequality has two different disagreement processes. One is called a dispute resolution process, and that is for disputes between implementers. And one is an issue resolution process that is aimed at helping to address disagreements related to purpose of use. As a lawyer, I have to start with what we're not going to be talking about. So let me get ready. We are not going to be talking about any specific dispute or disagreement. I know, if anybody wants to get up and leave, they can feel free. But we are talking more about thematic issues that Carequality has really learned from this past year in hopes of sharing it with you guys so that everybody in the room can learn from it. Because Carequality is not unique. There are many networks out there. There are many of you out there who have disagreement resolution processes. And so we wanted to be able to talk about some of the things that we have learned and experienced this year in hope of sharing that with you. So I want to turn it over to the panelists and let you guys introduce yourself, and then we'll jump in.
Right. My name is Buitendijk. I'm with Oracle Health. And within Carequality, I'm both on the board as well as in the steering committee, so participated in a number of these discussions.
I'm Sagnik, Bhattacharya. On the day job side of things, I'm at a company called Rhapsody, and then on Carequality, my role is as an independent board member.
Paul Wilder, excuse me. It's been a long night, people. Executive Director of CommonWell. I am a steering committee appointed or volunteered board member. So, pleasure to be here.
Great. So, the first theme we want to talk about is transparency versus confidentiality. So, when we think about disputes, disagreements in general, a lot of private parties choose to use an arbitration, a mediation, in order to keep their disagreement confidential and decide it amongst themselves. As you guys know, in traditional litigation, if you go to court, a lot of those court documents become public information, and there's no confidentiality. And so one of the things that we have been talking about and weighing throughout the year is that tension between confidentiality and transparency, because we understand that those in the network, those in the community want to understand what is going on so that they too can learn from different disagreements. And so Hans, I'll start with you for your perspectives on the tension there and how we reconcile those.
Yeah, and I think it's a definite tension because you have two parts. We have a very large community out there, not just the connections themselves and the implementers and everybody in between that's in play, but beyond that, there's interest because it's about sharing health data. So there is an interest to understand that if there are disagreements on what's going on, what does it mean, what should I do? And the disagreements can be ranging from very small areas of some technical issues to larger topics. Are we doing things right? But there is that interest within the community and outside. And if you say within the community, that's already a very public setting. At the same point in time as to what we're trying to achieve and agreements that we have, there is not only a requirement for confidentiality, but there's also a need for confidentiality because a disagreement inherently wants you to dig into areas to better understand what is it about, what's going on, how can we move forward. That inherently has the potential, high likelihood, if not guaranteed, that we need to dig into data that we normally don't share. And particularly in this kind of environment, we all look around who's next to us. We work with everybody to make interoperability work, but at the same point in time we compete, we are otherwise engaged, so we have a need to keep data confidentiality. about our operations, our individual workings and whatnot. So balancing that is just a challenge, particularly as the issues become larger in terms of interest, impact, and otherwise. But we have to preserve it for two reasons, I think, and why it's important to balance that. Is that we have agreed that certain information just is not helpful and necessary to be shared, because they are individual organizations' proprietary information that we still need to work together. The other part is that until you go through the agreement or disagreement discussions, we need to be able to make sure that we can look at that in a very neutral fashion. Then we can step back from all the other things. We can just look at that. Whoever is participating in that discussion, and that we have that comfort zone that we can say, yes, we can share. We'll figure out what it is, and then we come out. And that's where then the transparency comes back. There is a need to then share what have we learned, what's the outcome, what do we do, and everybody needs to become aware of it effectively in that way. So finding that balance of how much to share and how much not to share is an ongoing question in the back of our minds as we go through it. Different levels of impact depending on the kind of information. So from that perspective, what we're looking at is that share the least amount, and we are figuring out and learning what that least amount is, but share the least amount that still is enough to make sure everybody feels comfortable in the end that, yep, we figured it out. We came to a conclusion, it's the right one, or it's the best one that we can have. So I think that's why we constantly are kind of twisted between the two and say, can I talk about that? Can I share it? Can I not? But we need to know it to understand what happens.
Erin, knock knock.
Who's there?
HIPAA.
HIPAA who?
Sorry, can't disclose that information. and throughout the last 6 months or so, it's been quite a roller coaster. Personally, I was because I'm on the board but not on the steering committee. So as by design, the steering committee is the one arbitrating the dispute through all the dispute resolution committees and so on and so forth. So from a distance, I think the steering committee and the groups did a really nice job of firewalling the right sets of information. But then on the other side, I can imagine there are people who are kind of wondering, what's going on, and why isn't there a lot more transparency? And what I kind of came to realize through the process is there's what you see in the headlines part of it, and then there is a lot more nuance behind it. And trying to explain and having this be done in an open forum is challenging, because you don't know how that information might be interpreted. And then on the back end of it, once there is a decision made, once there is a resolution proposed, you want people to be able to stand behind it and not be able to point fingers at the integrity of that resolution. So, while there were many times during many a meeting, there was very uncomfortable level, why can't we just work on the steering committee, why can whoever be more just open and transparent about it? This was a lot of internal talk that did happen about how much should we share, how much should we not share, and we always erred on the side of the integrity of the process, and so that once immediately it's uncomfortable, once the decision has been made, then all parties involved can say, look, this was a fairly run process and it was not litigated in the media, it was done by the right group following the right set of things. So I think, while there were ups and downs through the process, I think in the end, keeping the level of, discretion that was applied was the right thing to do, and makes you take the long view, in my opinion.
Well, I don't have a knock-knock joke, so I think I lose already.
You can't talk about Bruno.
First of all, I think it's important to recognize Carequality generally is a consensus-based organization, right? And getting to consensus requires that people reveal information about what they're doing, what they expect to do, and what others are going to do. So there's a fair amount of transparency in what the market is doing on a regular basis. But I'm not competitive per se. Well, I guess, there are networks attached to Carequality, and we have some competition. Healthy competition is good. But, a lot of the implementers, you just saw the race car slide of all the the logos and sponsors of everything going on, right? And without implementers, it doesn't work. These are staunch competitors on a daily basis, right? It's hard to get a bunch of competitive entities in a room and get to a result that makes sense. But we do it. We do it every week. We do it every day. We do it every month. And so when you get to this process, it really kind of amps up the challenge of that, right? You're like, I want to know everything. But if I was in that room, I wouldn't want you to know everything either, right? So you inherently have this balance has to be struck of enough information to make people know that it's going the right way or it's being resolved, but not too much to accidentally harm an entity that shouldn't be harmed in the process. And I think we did a pretty good job striking that balance. I mean, I think there's a lot of people that are like, can this go faster? It's like, well, instead of thinking faster, and I won't, the detail, I know we're not talking the details of the dispute, but I'll talk about the details of the calendar, right? It took time. And if those are on the inside, and by the way, we were not on the inside. We were, there's like a hermetically sealed world of a dispute, then there's some information, and then there's the outside world. We were like, we want information too. It's like, well, no, but I really don't want it. Like, I don't need it. Just let's see what the process brings. So what we were monitoring, steering committee, oversight committee, the board, was, are we following our process? Right? If you're going to do something, do it the way you wrote it down. And you can do a post-mortem to decide what you want to change in terms of your internal SLAs, what you're going to speed up, what you're going to communicate. But make sure that the process itself is as pure to what you said it was going to be as possible. And then we'll see what the result is afterwards. And some people may love the result of that particular dispute, and some may find it insufficient for what they expected to happen. But that's kind of immaterial. The process itself needs to be followed, or else we have a problem. And I think under scrutiny, if you looked at what happened and kind of analyzed what happened, you'd have a tough time saying that the process wasn't followed the way it was supposed to be done.
So let's talk about the process.
Love process.
Love process. And this process is written down. It is an exhibit to the CCA, and it has timelines in it. And it has timelines that were designed about 10 years ago to provide for due process and representation and an opportunity for any party in a dispute to be able to provide its side of the dispute, to be able to provide its story, its evidence. And it has time in there for those who are hearing the dispute to analyze all of those really complicated issues. And as Paul said, that takes time. If you just look at the calendar that's set forth in that exhibit, if everything in the process happens at the maximum timelines, you're looking at over a year, right? And we've gotten feedback. We're looking at ways to improve that process, to speed up that process. But one of the tensions there is speed versus representation and due process, and simply getting people together and making calendars happen. So as you guys think about that and you think about how to improve it in the future, do you have any thoughts on how to weigh that balance? And Sagnik, I'll start with you this time.
Sure. So a couple of thoughts on this. First is, when you look at the 20-word description of what the issue is, it's very easy to jump to a conclusion on what that's pretty obvious. Why should it take that long? And I think there is usually there's a lot of nuance to it. A while back, I learned about this framework called the ladder of inference. Some of you may have heard about this, which is how quickly the human brain just sees a snippet of information and applies our beliefs, our thoughts, and so on, and jumps to some conclusion. Just as an example of that, it is you're stopped at a traffic light, a car breaks a red light and goes past you. Now, I live in Boston, happens all the time. They're called mass jerks. But you just kind of look at it and say, what a jerk. But then, just for a second, we take a pause. And let's say there was someone in the car who's, let's say, having a medical emergency, and they had to break the light and had to get to where you do. You don't have that information, so you make that judgment based on the limited piece of information that you have, which is they jumped the traffic light. Now, whether that was the right decision or not, we don't know. Maybe that was still not the right decision to do that, but there's more to it than meets the eye, is the point. So as things have unfolded, and we've probably seen different versions of it play out in different places, in social media and in blogs, and even in conversation. I kind of submitted to myself humbly because I was also getting pretty worked over. Like, why is this so hard? It should just be pretty straightforward. But there is a lot of nuance behind this, and that nuance sometimes takes time to unravel and kind of just really unpack by hearing from different parties. So that's one thing that it's not immediately apparent from the outside, but some of these things are just not overnight decisions. Having said that, the second part, I do think that our process is too slow. That I think we just got a pressure test of a process that was written 10 years ago with the best of intentions, and it is too slow. And we need to be able to move faster on that. And I think there's a lot of learnings that have been collected from this past few months, and I think it's kind of incumbent on the various committees within Carequality, within the management team, to really help expedite it for the next time around. We were also mindful that even while we were going through the process, we recognized that it was slow. We didn't want to change the goalposts while the process was ongoing, so we had to be fair about it. Now that we are on the other end of it, there is definitely work to be done to expedite the process.
Yeah, we are human beings. we look at people that procrastinate, and you're kind of like, oh, they're a procrastinator. Turns out most of you do. We did CommonWell had a summit 4 weeks ago, and I can attest that 60% of the registrants for that and the registrations for the hotel were in the last 2 weeks for an event that we had scheduled for 7 months, right? It's just kind of how we work. So the challenge with a calendar is people see the calendar and see a deadline, right? And I think it's more of it's not necessarily changing the process to force it to go better. It's the community clearly made it clear that if this is a 20-day process, can it be done in 5? Like, it would be nice, because when you take a bunch of things and then someone makes an extension, and we always have extensions, right? So if you think about this, someone comes in, has to dispute, someone has to defend the dispute. It is fair for the disputer, the person making the dispute, likely has prepared their entire case already, right? What they have an issue with, whatever. The other side's like, I didn't know you were coming. Like, no, there was probably an informal process happened before that, but they have to now prepare. So yes, there's absolutely, positively, someone on the other side needs to be able to prepare their story, right? Okay, so you give them time to do that. But in between, as you go back and forth, you have a deadline, you tend to get to that or one day before it. It's just kind of our nature. So I'm a little troubled by, yes, make it go faster, but also recognizing how difficult it was to schedule these people, right? Because the dispute panel, by the way, was not the board or steering committee. It was close. It was some outside experts, but they have a real job to do too, right? And so them sitting for hours and hours, this isn't jury duty where you're compelled to do it or you go to jail, right? This is, please help, right? Would you like to help? And you can recuse yourself and say, no, I don't have time to help. But everybody raised their hand, and I think they did a good job with what the enormity of what they had to do. But I am a little challenged of how to make it go faster, because it is hard when you see this is take 20 days and someone says, I need an extension. You're kind of like, well, I don't know if it's supposed to take 30 or if you delayed. Okay, fine, as long as the other party agrees. So it's going to inherently have all this extension. I do think it behooves us to think about from a community and management of Carequality as well, that if this were to happen again, and by the way, we had one dispute, well, I guess it was a dispute and a counter dispute if you want to be technical about it, but in its existence of Carequality, going back to 2014, right? 1, right? So the likelihood of seeing another one soon, not so high. But if it does, I think we would have a little bit more of, we understand the calendar, but can we go a little faster? I don't know if I would change the calendar, I guess is my, it's funny when you go through this whole process, you get to a postmortem, you go, what would you change? Well, it sucked, but I still don't think I would do anything differently. And I think that's a strange learning when you get to the end and you figure out the valuable time that people are providing and the enormity of what you're trying to do. You can't make it go faster than it has to go, or else you ruin some other problems. You create some other problems.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on the number. There's an interesting saying in this context, which may or may not apply, but practice makes perfect. Well, that requires a number of times to go through to figure it out. It's the first time that it happened. Please, that doesn't mean I want to see any more. But we also need to recognize that there are a couple of phases to this. It's not just when we talk about disagreement. It starts somewhere, and then that starts to percolate and bubble up. And what we rapidly also start to figure out is that is there a stage before you really call something a more formal dispute that we can have an opportunity to dig in, but it's not really a dispute. So it is a progression of how it goes through. And when you look at that, I'm not convinced to say that right now is that we look at the process, the timelines that we set, they all sounded reasonable 10 years ago. Is that necessarily too long per se? Or have we not spent enough time in some of the other phases to really understand it and figure it out? So I think, yes, there is the sense of something takes too long, or can we do it faster? But I think we then need to look at the overall process from what can we prevent, how can we discover, how can we initially talk about it to figure out, hey, what is it really, before the other phases start to kick in. So I think we need to look at it overall and see what can we do there. When we look at TEFCA, it has started to pick up some of those learnings clearly by observing what's happening. Helps that there's a lot of overlap between those two communities. But I think that's what we need to look at as well, is that we may at times look at, yes, this first one, is that what was it? But we also need to look at overall. It takes time from the moment that you say there might be a problem, what can we do? Let's just chat about it, to discuss it a little bit more versus I'm going to go into a full-blown process to figure it out. Again, I'm not convinced that we are ready to really convincingly say we need to change the timelines, but that we need to learn more. But I'm hoping that practice makes perfect is not going to apply.
As you were talking, just one thing came to mind that I want to remind people of. The dispute process, what we're talking about is the formal dispute process. There's actually in the rules written an informal process supposed to happen before that. I don't take my neighbor to court because they left the garbage can out on the sidewalk, right? I say, hey, can you start bringing in your garbage can earlier? Like it's just ugly sitting out there, right? You don't bring them to court for that. First you have a conversation, and if they're belligerent, well, maybe you consider a next step. The reality is there's a lot of informal conversations that happen well before that. And from a learning perspective, it's almost like that's the part that needs some work, right? How do you recognize patterns of concerns over time to avoid a dispute and inform people of the weird things that may or may not be occurring? And I think there we could use some work. We created the IRS, right, which is pay your taxes, everyone. But it's designed to be a pre-dispute process to get people together and say, I don't want to do anything wrong. Before I do, I want to socialize what's going on and see what you think. And then we all go, oh, okay. It's like a pre-vetting process before you get to a problem. So think about that more than the dispute itself, because that's the end. That's like, I've had enough. No one's listening. I got to do something. And it's like, were you not listening? If you look at the results, like, well, what really happened? Well, some things got fixed and processed and whatever. But in the end, it was kind of like two parties not communicating correctly to get to what they need to resolve.
And keep that in mind, some of the discussion yesterday it's very interesting with the questions on 3-4 different use cases and descriptions of what is treatment, what's the nuance. Pick any kind of purpose or agreement, but you can see the kind of conversation that can happen there. That takes time to figure it all out. Are we looking at it this way, that way, somewhere else?
Yeah, well, clearly I'm the impatient one in the group. I do think the looking at it holistically, I agree with it, which is how do we just avoid a dispute process in the first place? What are the learnings that we could take that we could have be more prophylactic earlier to address some of the simmering things that might lead to a dispute and do that sooner? I'd also push to say, let's look at ways that technology can be used to be proactive, to suss out any of these patterns that might lead to a future dispute and act on it. I mean, ultimately, we're dealing with electronic data, so there might be options to look at how we can use that data to inform any kind of patterns that we are seeing and act on it. So ultimately, it's basically the dispute process, as stated, is kind of the last reckoning, if you will. I also think that as TEFCA emerges, as other networks form all over the place, and for what it's worth, there are other countries who are now trying to do similar efforts, and they're kind of looking at us as kind of in terms of how we are handling some of these things. So, I mean, personally, I believe there's a lot that we could do even prior to a dispute starting to actually prevent disputes to happen in the first place, and that all starts with both process as well as with technology.
And Paul, it was a good reminder on the issue resolution process that Carequality designed earlier this year to try and head off some of those issues before they become issues, right? When there are questions about a purpose of use. And it was intended to be that front-end process before you get to a dispute so that somebody can ask and get the consensus from the community, but even that takes time, right? It was designed to be a quicker process, but they're complicated issues. And so even that takes some time. Now that process, the issue resolution process, as well as dispute resolution, involves members of the community making a decision. And Paul, as you pointed out, members of the community can be competitors, right? We've got a lot of people in the room, but we all play in the same space. And so when we think about who is making the decision on an issue, who is making the decision on a disagreement or a dispute, how do we evaluate conflicts of interest? And how do we distinguish between those conflicts of interest that we simply acknowledge and are part of the process because of the community in which we work, and those that are actually disqualifying conflicts that should remove an organization or that organization's representative from being part of a decision-making body? So, Paul, you mentioned conflicts. I'll throw it to you.
So, interestingly enough, if you did look at the calendar and look at the process, and in your spare time, feel free to do so. One of the things that was hard to do was establishing the panel itself. Right, so the dispute panel is 3 individuals that are going to sit there as both jury and judge in some respect. Now they give a recommendation to the steering committee, so they're not the final say in it. And the steering committee then adopts that or modifies it as they see fit based on the evidence that's given to them. But we took a long time, partially because, to be honest, my opinion, we erred too far on the side of avoiding conflict. Right, so. We're all adults in this room. We all are part of a consensus-based organization, and CommonWell is as well. My board is made up of direct competitors that you enter that room. You have to leave your badge at the door, as we say, and be a fiduciary of the organization that you're working with. And it's nearly impossible. It's not always true, but with certain implementers, it's going to be nearly impossible to not have a conflict. Right, so Sagnik's with Rhapsody. Do you know how many things that's embedded in? Like if I were to say, well, I can't be on this because I have products and services that connect to that, that's impossible, right? You think of, many of people in this room, of course you're connected, you compete with them. Everyone is conflicted with almost everybody. And sometimes that conflict is positive, sometimes negative. Sometimes you're competitors, sometimes you're partners. And in the real world, that would be a conflict itself because you have a bias in either direction. You almost have to look at, in my opinion, looking at the biases averaging themselves out as opposed to trying to avoid all of them. That you put enough people, enough focus, and enough data that, in a room where you're trying to get, again, to a consensus-based, result, that everybody can eventually, push that down or get convinced by their peers to do so. Because I did find that part a little frustrated, and others know that I voiced that. I was like, everybody's conflicted. We're never going to solve this problem if we don't just start getting people in a room and start listening to this thing. And I think in the end, By the way, I was with one of the dispute panel people at a bar last night, imagine that. And he wouldn't tell me anything. He was very good about that. But thank him for what he did. Like that's a pretty large commitment. But the commitment isn't just the time. It's taking yourself out of what you do and sitting someplace else and saying, what would I do objectively to this? And I think while there's a lot of conflicts in the world, I think people are better at doing that when they're asked to do it than we give them credit for when you allow them to sit, listen, and be fair. And I think that's what we saw happen. So that part of the phase, I think we could do a lot faster, right? Because we shouldn't vet that hard. We're not sending someone to jail. It's okay.
Well, and I think when we've been talking about trust as a thing, I think there needs to be a little bit of a community of trust in this room to a large extent as well. I think most people are here because of the mission and what we're trying to do. And while we get into the minutiae of the dispute this or process that, the one thing, again, this is proving that I'm old, 15 years ago there was no interoperability like we have today. And we had health systems in the same city not sharing data with each other because they're competitors to some extent now. But I think that was at a very macro talk, but I think you talk to physicians on both sides, they'll be, yeah, absolutely, it's going to lead to better care for the patient. And we've kind of gotten over all of that hurdle over the last 10 years. There's been massive accomplishments, and thanks to a lot of people sitting in this room and a lot of giants of interoperability that we have in our midst, doing 1 billion documents exchanged every month. So all of those things are leading to really good outcomes because people have just kind of gotten over the supposed commercial interests and so on, and they say, okay, we're in it for the mission. We're going to share. We're going to figure out the best way to share, and it's kind of almost like this nebulous thing, but there's like shared trust community. And I think to agree with you, Paul, which is yes, there are people who on the business end of things might compete for business in their customers, just like health systems compete for the business of getting patients. But you still come together under a shared mission to make this thing work and make this thing happen. To me, I agree that this is a friendly group. It doesn't matter who we are with, who you compete with on the commercial side. We should be able to trust each other and get along.
And from that perspective, is that the balancing out of some of the conflicts that are naturally there. Given some of those common objectives of we are trying to share and have to recognize is that if you are in this space of interoperability, sharing data, and you look too much at your own areas and what that might, how it might benefit out of that as well, and let that drive it versus the community overall, you're going to miss the boat. That is, it's two-way street. So yes, there are conflicts, but I agree with Paul. In a way, they are going to balance out in the process in the various stages and how you can manage that, so that that's there. Plus, we have the opportunity. We have exercised the opportunity to call in, quote unquote, a friend. In this case, subject matter experts. They are not as close to the process. We can bring them into the process where needed and help balance that where we need to get that more specific view in particular areas. So it's not going to be perfect in this kind of a process. And actually, if you go on to the stage that we're not supposed to talk about, that you said litigation, whatever, is that guess what? There's still the opportunity to have that kind of conflicts as well and otherwise. So the balancing out is I think, an important part. And the common objective that we have. It is a two-way street, multi-way street. What goes around comes around. We need to work this out in a way that works for everybody the best. Might not be perfect in somebody's mind that way, but what gets us as a community moving forward so that we can, with high reliability, exchange data. I think that's the end that we have to rely on, that everybody largely is their interest in mind, and that's the hat that they will wear in this discussion. How can we make it happen more transparently, et cetera?
Yeah, 100% agree. Yeah, you think about being on that panel, we actually had trouble thinking about do they need to be Carequality aware, or should they be outsiders? So we had SMEs, subject matter experts, that helped that process, which I think was critical to getting through, right? So it's very important to be knowledgeable of Carequality structure and have a general idea of terms, conditions, and the general rules, all the things that we know about every day. Alan's here somewhere. I cannot cite sections of the terms and conditions like he can. You're like, oh, 14.2 says this. I'm like, oh, okay, I thought it was 13.7, but that's fine. It's not my job to know that well, but you have to know that it's somewhere in that document there's something about X, Y, or Z. So you can't go completely outside, right? This isn't a jury of your peers that have no knowledge of law, right? Because that's people that get put in a real jury, right? We have a bias against lawyers on the jury, first of all, right? The more educated you are about the thing, the less likely that you're supposed to be there. This is the opposite, right? And I can imagine how much slower or ridiculous the result would have been if we didn't have people that actually have the conflict, that have knowledge. I'd rather have the history, understanding how the community works, what we built in the first place, be in that room, than have outsiders that are lost in asking questions all the time. Is that the way it's supposed to work? Because then we have a bias of interpretation, right? And so part of having these people that are conflicted and they have positive, negative biases, at least they have knowledge of some of the history and how we generally operate to bring into that room, which I think beats up a fair amount of that bias, right? And also keep in mind, the final thing to keep in mind is when they leave that room and they make a recommendation, the steering committee endorses it or modifies it, whatever it is, there's always like, how would I want to be treated in this? Because I am the same person, right? This isn't like someone, you mentioned the person that ran the red light, and let's say they got in an accident and they're on a court case. Like, I'm not that guy. I can definitely, penalize that person because I'm not that person, right? In this case, it's like, be careful. I could be here next, right? And so I want to learn, I want to understand, but I also understand that this has to continue to exist. We can't be finger pointing and being in a dispute process forever on everything, or then we're in big, big trouble, right? In general, trust has to exist. It can't be built. It has to exist for it to be built better. You can't start with no trust to build this kind of a framework. And so, it inherently has its own tension involved, and that tension leads to the right result.
So when you talk about those who are hearing a disagreement, and you talk about they have some familiarity with Carequality versus no familiarity, we start to think about and ask questions going forward about who should be hearing these disputes. Should it be a panel of 3? Should it be a panel of 5? Should it be an outside third party? Should it be subject matter experts? We know in TEFCA that ASTP has been granted the authority to make final decisions about exchange purposes, if there are questions about how exchange purposes are being used. So they really serve as kind of that third-party backstop in that process. Private networks don't necessarily have that backstop, but I think the question is, should they? And if so, what would that even look like? Hans, you want to start?
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting question because that comes up in times. Did we have adequate representation in different places throughout the process? But in the end, what happens if we get to a quote-unquote tie? What do we do? Where do we go? So part of those are theoretical questions in a way, but that you kind of skirt or get into. Having a backstop in itself is fine. We need to ultimately have a place where it stops. I think within Carequality we define that. There's a place to go. But there are in some areas when you say, well, where is the... if you go and look at this from a technical perspective, you can get a subject matter expert on the technology. If you're looking at other areas, you can say, I pull in a clinical expert in to do that, et cetera, et cetera. But where do you go for some of the final interpretations of what is meant by... You knocked on the door about HIPAA and I cannot talk about it, but what do you really mean with HIPAA, and you go there. So up to a point you can say, we still have lots of expertise. Where does that stop? So having the opportunity for a backstop like that, as Tefka is talking about, I think is helpful. I am not convinced that if you're not in the kind of relationship that happens to exist and is possible with Tefka, so with the Carequality, whether you can make that happen. So I think that's where we still are looking within the community and are using the SMEs and the members and that combination, that pool of knowledge to really make it work. But we have a unique situation with Tefka where that is possible in some areas.
I think the best way is consensus, but recognizing the fact that sometimes the consensus might be elusive and you need a decision made. And so I think that would be something to look at, is that it's not a single person, but it might be like a small group or something to really break the ties, if you will. I think that might be something to look at from a process improvement perspective. I do think that hopefully that's the number of things in that bucket is smaller and smaller as we start to codify what all of this stuff really means. I mean, yesterday we had all those examples of, is this treatment? Because it's not like the ASTP has a magic, like somehow insight to say that, oh yeah, this is clearly treatment and this is not. You guys were all just futzing around. So I think ultimately, like, no matter who it is, like, there has to be a stopping point to say, yeah, this is a 51-49 thing, but we as a community are going to go this way, and then codify that so that we don't have to relitigate that the next time. But to me, that I think that's an extreme edge case, in my opinion. I think as a group with the right amount of focus and discussion, people will converge to an opinion or to some sort of a middle ground. And I expect the number of times something like that is needed will be very rare.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, interesting point. So do you take the vetting process when we have a defined thing where the ONC, RC and ONC together kind of have a backstop. So for those who are not aware, just a little bit of a quick history here. So if you're trying to assert that this endpoint that I'm putting on in the directory and is going to start doing exchange in TEFCA, that it's a treatment eligible organization, you have to put it into a system that has a delay hold before it's released to the real one, right? And the idea is that you put in this temporary bin for everybody to review and say, oh yeah, I understand what that kind of thing is, that's cool. And if not, say, it's object, but I think it's actually, we made a bad word for it. I object to this one. It's really, I have a question that isn't resolved yet, so I want to have a live discussion because the data isn't making sense to me, right? So you hit the button, you say, I object, and then we're going to go to a meeting where someone describes it verbally. And the fact of the matter is, like, I don't know about all of you, but I know I am, and I assume many of you are. We're just email processors half of our life right now, right? That's like, and the amount of things that we resolve by actually getting on a call, right, changes everything. Like, you can sit there, and I've drafted the email once. It took me 4 hours, like, get this thing pristine. And I'm like, what am I doing? Just have a 5-minute meeting, and we'll get this over with. But there's some, the ONC, the TEFCA one has this, and if you all can't agree, right, it actually requires consensus. To get through this process, by the way, so there's 7 QNs, there'll be 9, and whatever it is, everyone has to agree to not object. Everyone. You can't, it's not a majority vote, it's not a supermajority, it's everyone. So one person says, or one entity says no, we have the ONC to go to. And think about how much of a weird thing that is. Like, aside from in our lives, we see like the Supreme Court as a final decider. You may not like the result, but it's done, right? There's so many things in life, we just do not have that. My daughter the other day, 6:15 in the evening, is asking to go out to get ice cream, and we're eating dinner at 7. Like, no, right? And how many more times did she ask me between 6:15 and 6:45 to whittle me down to say yes? Right there, I had, I guess maybe I should have like the grandma calls. Like, I'm calling grandma, she's the arbiter. If she says no, this is a ridiculous request, and she wants to say yes to everything you ask for, right? So let's go there. Now, she went at 8 o'clock, so the negotiation was after dinner you can go, but it took forever. So it's actually not normal to have this backstop of what you consider the adult in the room, which the irony of what I just said is I was the adult in the room and I was getting beat up by a 13-year-old. So, it's kind of a privilege to have that final say that says, okay, we all had a little disagreement, but we think it should be this. So I think as we look at adopting some of the TEFCA stuff and bringing it over, I'm not so sure we have to have those features, but I think we have to think about whether we value them or not, right? Do we have to have a backstop, a third party, a SME or something that when we can't resolve it, it goes to? Most of the time we resolve stuff. The problem with consensus, it takes a long time. And the speed, I can attest that Sagnik is not lying when he said he was the most frustrated with speed of anybody on the board. That is true. He stated it, so I feel I can restate it, but he's not lying. I wasn't thrilled with it either, but you know, it is hard, and so when you do consensus stuff, things take a long time. And balancing getting to a faster resolution is hard. The main problem I get concerned about with that speed is, am I harming someone's ability to compete in the market, right, unnecessarily? Right? And the part that's the DNA of CommonWell as a trade association, and you know, market, you know, go, compete, have fun, you know, do what you got to do. But you know, there are entrants coming in that are expecting a certain thing to happen. They think they're doing everything right, and they think tomorrow they're going to turn this thing live, or 7 days from tomorrow after they come in the system, and then they can put a holding bin. And I think there's some sensitivity to that. We recognize that we don't want to restrict the ability for providers and their products to do what they were designed to do. But once in a while, we have to say, hold on a second, something doesn't smell right, and we have to have a discussion. So I think it's hard to do that balance. I don't know if we bring some of the processing from TEFCA, if Carequality is going to have that kind of, you know, the extra adult in the room, that, you know, the grandma to say you can't get ice cream right now. I don't know if we need it, but it is a privilege to have it.
Great. So I was going to give you each a minute to do closing remarks,
Oops.
but I see that we are at 30 seconds. So I'm going to sum it up on behalf of the panel, and we'll see if you guys agree or disagree. Okay. It's really hard.
Done.
Mic drop, gotta go.
Let's go.
So with that, we thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys very much for participating. And
Thank you.
I think interoperability matters is next.